People think money can buy anything, even life. But what happens when a millionaire tries to turn motherhood into a business transaction? This isn't just another real story. It's a touching real story that flips everything you believe about power, love, and redemption. He offered cash. She had nothing to lose. But neither of them imagined that what started as a cold deal with a homeless woman would spiral into one of the most moving stories you'll ever hear. If you've ever judged someone by their status or thought emotions could be controlled, this true story will prove you wrong. And by the end of it, you'll realize some contracts are written in ink, but the most important ones are written in the heart. Henry Lewis wasn't the kind of man who let emotions steer the wheel. Born into wealth and sharpened by cold boardroom decisions, he saw life through numbers, not feelings. So when he offered a homeless woman a contract to carry his child, it wasn't out of compassion, it was a business strategy. No strings, no love, just ink on paper. This wasn't just a story, it was a real story. A moving story hidden behind a cold transaction. And like many stories about people, it would unfold with consequences no contract could control. Layla Parker, living on the edge of survival, wasn't looking for a miracle, just a warm place to sleep. When Henry made his offer, it felt less like opportunity and more like surrender. Her hands shook as she read the terms, and her soul screamed for clarity. But in a world where desperation drowns dreams, she had little room for idealism. This wasn't just survival, it was the beginning of a true story, the kind that turns into touching stories whispered across generations. Henry promised comfort, safety, and a future she could never imagine. But the offer came wrapped in ice. There was no talk of connection, no hint of warmth, just legal language and cold outlines. It was less of a love story and more of a calculated plan. He wanted a legacy, not a bond. Layla wasn't sure if she was accepting protection or selling her soul. This was a story with Amaral, a quiet storm brewing between wealth and willpower. Layla hesitated, but hunger has a way of silencing hesitation. How many people have made choices they regret just to survive one more day? That's not just her truth, it's a life story many carry in silence. And in that silence, she signed. Her signature wasn't just ink, it was a scream muffled by poverty. This wasn't just a contract, it was a turning point in a real-life stories chapter about how desperation and hope often wear the same face. After the deal, Henry returned to his high-rise world of meetings and imported wine. Layla was moved to a hotel room, far from cold streets, but even further from freedom. No calls, no check-ins, just silence. It was a pause in the plot, a deep breath before the next act. Many impressive stories start quietly then explode. This surprising story was waiting to catch fire, and neither of them saw the match coming. It's easy to judge choices like Layla's until you've felt the chill of concrete under your back. The real weight of this touching real story isn't in the deal, it's in what the deal awakens. Because when someone offers you a lifeline wrapped in conditions, the question becomes, do you reach for it, or do you drown with your pride? This wasn't just about money. It was about power, identity, and the haunting echoes of what we give up when we've got nothing left. What started as a cold, calculated deal was about to become something far more human. Because life has a funny way of pulling the rug from under the most controlled plans. The deeper the transaction, the deeper the consequences. And as we'll soon see, even the most ironclad contracts can't hold back the messy beauty of a moving story when real people are involved. In the quiet hours after signing the contract, Layla felt the weight of her decision settle into her chest like wet cement. The promise of shelter and security no longer felt like freedom, it felt like a cage built with silk bars. She tried to convince herself it was just a deal, a cold exchange. But when you're carrying a life inside you, nothing is ever just business. This was becoming more than a real-life story setup, it was the beginning of an inner war. She sat on the edge of her new bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had just sold her soul or saved it. The world called it a smart move, but her heart called it something else entirely. There's a part of every touching real story where the mind and the soul stop speaking to each other. That's where Layla was suspended in doubt, haunted by a decision that couldn't be undone. This wasn't just a story with a moral. It was a living question she had to answer daily. She tried to distract herself with books, movies, even late-night walks in the garden, but none of it muted the echo of what was growing inside her. The children she carried weren't just cells in biology. They were parts of her, born from brokenness but nurtured in hope. And in that hope, she began to feel something Henry never included in the deal of. That unexpected attachment made the entire life story shift, turning a cold plan into an inspiring story waiting to bloom. Layla started writing letters to her unborn child, even though she knew she might never get to read them aloud. It was her way of reclaiming her voice in a process that had stripped it away. That's something anyone in a tight spot can downright it out, even if no one else reads it. This act of silent rebellion, of emotional anchoring, is what makes real story so powerful. You don't need permission to feel, you just need space. She remembered a woman at the shelter who once said, "It's not the decisions we make, it's the silence we live with afterward that hurts most." Layla felt that truth in her bones. Every hour that passed pulled her deeper into an intense reflection of who she really was. Was she a mother? A contract? A survivor? This inner dialogue became the pulse of her touching story's arc, the heartbeat of her personal overcoming journey. She couldn't shake the image of handing her baby to a stranger in a suit, no matter how many zeros were in the bank account. The thought of letting go twisted her stomach. Because letting go of a child isn't just about loss, it's about erasing a part of your own identity. And that's the kind of wound money can't heal. This wasn't a deal anymore. It was a countdown to heartbreak. But something else was stirring beneath the fear. Resolve. Because even in the darkest corners of doubt, a spark was forming. Layla didn't know what she would do when the moment came, but she knew she'd no longer be the same woman who signed that contract. And when change begins within, everything around you starts to shift. Something unexpected was growing not just in her belly, but in her spirit. And that's where the next twist in this moving story takes root. Moving into Henry's mansion was like stepping into a different galaxy. Marble floors, gold accents, silence so thick it rang in her ears. Layla had never walked halls like these, let alone lived in them. But luxury, when you come from the streets, doesn't feel like a reward, it feels like surveillance. Every pillow fluffed, every meal delivered, reminded her this wasn't her world, it was a set. And she was just playing a role in someone else's real-life festery's blueprint. She had space, warmth, and safety for the first time in years, but none of it felt earned. That's the thing about trauma, it doesn't vanish just because your address changes. Layla wandered through the rooms like a ghost in designer pajamas. She didn't belong, and she knew it. Her life story had been hijacked by someone else's agenda. That discomfort, that invisible weight, is a silent chapter in many touching real story arcs that no one talks about. And then, something shifted. One morning, Henry left a small box on her breakfast tray. Inside, a sketchbook, a set of graphite pencils, and a quiet note, for when the noise inside is too loud. That was the first time she cried in the mansion. Art had been her anchor long before the streets swallowed her up. And with that simple gesture, her hands remembered who she was. It was the first unscripted moment in a real story that had started to feel mechanical. She began to draw. At first, it was just shapes and shadows. But soon, her emotions bled into portraits, visions of the child growing inside her, the streets she left behind, the face she thought she'd forgotten. Her sketchbook became a safe house, a place where contracts didn't exist and feelings could run wild. For anyone feeling lost in someone else's world, creative expression is a powerful way to reclaim identity. It's not just therapy, it's resistance. Henry never asked about the drawings, but he noticed. He'd pass by the sunroom and glance in, lingering just a second too long. Something in his posture softened, like he was seeing her as more than a vessel. And maybe for the first time, he questioned his own intentions. This wasn't in the plan. Business deals don't evolve, but this moving story was already rewriting its own rules. Layla, for her part, still kept her distance. One kind gesture didn't erase the imbalance, but art gave her agency. For the first time since signing the contract, she felt like a person again. The mansion was no longer a cage, it was a canvas. And in that transformation, the house started to feel less like a stranger and more like a chapter in her inspiring story. A painful one, sure, but real. And just as she began to settle into this new rhythm, the universe threw a curveball so wild, it shattered the calm entirely. Because every powerful, touching story's journey has that one moment where everything shifts and you realize the story was never just about you. The ultrasound room was sterile, quiet, and humming with cold machinery until the nurse looked twice at the screen and paused. "There's two," she said softly, and those simple words shattered everything Layla thought she understood. Two heartbeats, two lives, two souls growing inside her, kicking from the inside of a touching real story she hadn't planned. That moment didn't just surprise her, it split her world in half. Henry, ever composed, stood there stiffly as the technician repeated the news. Twins. It echoed like thunder in a conference room. His eyebrows tightened not in anger, but something else. Something even he couldn't name. Because no spreadsheet, no contract, no calculated offer had prepared him for a real-life story's twist like this. Suddenly, the plan didn't fit anymore. The plan was too small. Layla's hands instinctively moved to her belly, as if to protect what had just been revealed. Two babies meant two pieces of herself. Twice the love, twice the fear, twice the weight of goodbye. She wasn't just a temporary vessel now. She was becoming a mother in every sense. That's the magic of real life. It doesn't wait for permission. Moving story doesn't ask if you're ready. It just begins. For Henry, the shock morphed into stillness. He canceled 2 meetings that day, something he never did, and sat alone in his study for hours. He didn't say much, but something inside him shifted. Was it awe? Was it terror? Maybe both. Because even the coldest minds feel warmth when faced with new life. And this surprising story was melting ice he thought was permanent. The next morning, he placed his hand gently on Layla's stomach awkwardly, hesitantly, but it was a gesture he'd never made before. No words, just contact. A silent acknowledgement. It wasn't romantic. It was real. And sometimes, that's more powerful. Touching stories are built on those moments, the quiet ones that rewrite everything. Layla felt the change too, not just in her body, but in the space between them. It wasn't love yet, but it wasn't business either. Something in between was growing, like a seed cracking through concrete. And isn't that what the best life stories are made of? Two people facing the unknown, equally unprepared but quietly willing to show up anyway. And just like that, the story shifted from a contract to something messier, riskier, more human. They were no longer just man and surrogate. They were two people orbiting a truth too big to ignore. The deal hadn't accounted for twins, or for feelings, but now both were here. And the next phase of this real story, it would challenge them in ways they never imagined. The contract was still on the shelf, untouched, but its grip had started to loosen. What began as a signed agreement now sat like a relic of a life that no longer made sense. Henry found himself lingering near Layla's favorite spots, the sunroom, the garden bench, just to talk, not about legal terms or due dates, but about books, music, and even childhood memories. Slowly, awkwardly, stories about people began to replace pages of law. One evening, they sat beneath soft lighting, sipping tea and laughing about a painting Layla had made of his scowl. It wasn't flirtation. It was familiarity. She told him about the streets she used to sketch on. He told her about his father who only cared about numbers. And in that shared vulnerability, they both paused. That's the beauty of a touching real story. It sneaks up on you when you stop pretending. Their conversations became bridges, not walls. Layla found herself looking forward to his presence, even when she didn't want to. Henry, in turn, began noticing the small thing show she hummed while she drew, how she always offered the last piece of cake. These weren't grand gestures, they were human ones. And when life starts whispering instead of shouting, moving story begins. Even silence between them started to feel safe. Henry confessed one night, voice barely above a whisper, that he'd never known what it meant to love without conditions. Layla didn't respond right away because sometimes the best reply is just staying present. In that moment, The contract was nothing more than paper. Their eyes met, and for the first time, so did their souls. It's moments like these that make real-life stories unforgettable. They began walking together after dinner, quiet laps around the estate. No phones, no staff, just footsteps and conversation. Henry asked about her drawings. Layla asked about his mother. With every step, the distance between them shrank, not by force, but by choice. And that's what transforms a surprising story into a story with a moral. People choosing presence over perfection. It wasn't perfect. Henry still guarded his emotions like fragile antiques, and Layla still questioned if any of it was real. But growth doesn't require certain tie-only effort. And every shared joke, every tear not hidden, built something sturdier than money. That's what inspiring story is really about. Building connection where no one expected it, especially when the odds said it couldn't happen. And just when comfort began to feel natural, something deeper took root. An ache not of pain, but of longing. The kind that reminds you, this isn't just a passing chapter. This is the part of the life story where love begins to whisper and everything else starts to change. The delivery room was filled with tension, light, and the rawest kind of silence, the kind that comes right before a scream. And then it happened. 2 cries, seconds apart. 2 lives arriving into a world they didn't ask for, but would change forever. Henry, watching from the side, felt his hands tremble for the first time in years. This wasn't part of the plan. This was real-life histories colliding with real emotion. Layla held them both, tears pouring freely, not from pain, but from awe. She hadn't realized how much love she was carrying until she saw their tiny faces. For the first time, her heart wasn't split, it was whole. Henry approached, slow and unsure, like a man walking into holy ground. And when he saw the twins, he knew this wasn't a business anymore. It was a touching, real story unfolding in his arms. Hours later, he sat beside her hospital bed, silent, looking at the contract folded in his hand. It had gotten them here, but it didn't belong anymore. What mattered now was not what had been agreed, but what had been born. That's the thing about moving story moments. They don't care about logic. They only ask if you're willing to feel. Henry was. For the first time, fully. He stood, walked to the window, and without fanfare, tore the contract in 2. No speech, no announcement. Just a simple action that echoed louder than words. Layla watched him, stunned, as the pieces fluttered to the floor. That act was the real beginning of their love story, a declaration without a ring, but with everything that mattered. Some inspiring story arcs begin not with love at first sight, but with truth at last breath. Henry looked at her, eyes open, voice clear. No more deals, only choices. It wasn't romantic, it was raw, honest. The kind of moment that rewrites the past. She nodded, holding their children close, unsure of what came next, but finally willing to believe in the unknown. This wasn't about wealth anymore. This was about family history they would build from scratch. Layla later found the torn contract pressed inside one of her sketchbooks. She didn't throw it away. She kept it not as a reminder of a cold past, but of the day things changed. A symbol that even intense, calculated beginnings can lead to something beautiful. Because sometimes, the most powerful true story is the one that defies all logic. And that's exactly where they were now, off the map. And just as love settled into the room like light through a window, a shadow lingered too. Not everything broken heals overnight. Not every wall crumbles with a gesture. Because in every touching story's journey, after the moment of connection, comes the fear of losing it all again. Layla had felt this fear before, the kind that whispers, "Don't get too comfortable." She had learned to expect good things to disappear. So even as the warmth between her and Henry grew, a voice inside kept asking, how long until he leaves? Trust, for someone like her, doesn't bloom, it crawls. And in many real-life stories, the hardest part isn't love, it's believing it's real. At night, while holding one of the twins, she'd stare at the ceiling, heart pounding with a question she never dared ask. Will he change his mind? Henry sensed the distance, though she never spoke it aloud. He'd reach for her hand, and she'd freeze just for a second. Trauma leaves fingerprints on every touch, Touching real story moments don't erase the past. They just offer a new way to carry it. One morning, Layla broke. The pressure, the memories, the fear, they all exploded over breakfast. She accused him of planning to disappear, of pretending, of setting her up for heartbreak. Henry didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just listened. And in moving story arcs like this, sometimes the most powerful move is staying still. Later that day, he returned with a photo album his own, pictures of a boy with cold eyes, a mother who rarely smiled, and a father who never hugged. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly, "but I want to learn." That was the moment the walls truly cracked. Because inspiring story isn't just about overcoming the world, it's about unlearning what it taught you. They cried that night, together, not from pain, but from release. Two people, both shaped by absence, finally letting presence be enough. The twins slept between them as if guarding the peace. That's the power of a touching story's moment. It heals without fixing, accepts without demanding. And from that night on, the silence between them became sacred, not scary. Layla still had doubts, she did too, but now they shared them, out loud, openly, with fear, but also with hope. They talked about what scared them, what broke them, and what they wanted to rebuild. Every conversation added a brick to their foundation. And that's the beauty of stories about people. Real growth sounds like honesty, not perfection. And while healing doesn't come with guarantees, it does come with choice. They chose each other, day after day, not because they had to, but because they could. And somewhere in that slow, imperfect rhythm, a new version of family began to form. But even in love, there's always one last test waiting, one final chapter that asks, will you still stay, even when the winds change? So now I ask you, what would you have done in their place? Would you have trusted someone who once saw you as nothing more than a contract? Would you let love grow where only business existed? This wasn't just a life story about money or survival. It was a story with a moral, about forgiveness, vulnerability, and what it really means to be seen. If this touching real story moved you even a little, don't let it end here. What lessons can you apply to your own life? Who have you judged too quickly? Think about it. And if you want more real stories like this, true, powerful, unforgettable, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next.